we spend like 4 times as much on healthcare per person as France does for significantly worse service in a variety of ways. And so the reason that's not a political issue is because the more money you spend on healthcare, the bigger the total GDP stat is. Kenya has an economy. So Kenya has an economy 6 times its size, in fact, compared to its GDP stats. Because the way GDP stats are measured, Kenya is measured at 1/6 its real size. And so what they're looking at, and so I could tell, even as a teenager, I could tell when I was 16 or 15, that quality of life had gotten worse since the 70s because I talked to my parents and I would watch older movies. And it was obvious from older movies and my parents that average life had gotten worse. But if you brought that up, people would immediately jump down your throat. And it wasn't even a discussion. And it's because total GDP number went up. And if total GDP goes up, even if that's mostly inflation, then you're winning. It's this very warped tunnel vision understanding of the world.
Okay, so how much do you think of what is happening right now is just inescapable biological cycles? And how much of this is bad ideology that if we could replace the ideology, we could move in a better direction?
Whoa, man, everything is itself and yet nothing. All things are connected, man.
Am I going to need to hit on the bong for this answer?
Yeah, so it's hard to disentangle things, I think, because, okay, I'm not going to give you the philosopher answer. A lot of it's natural cycle, a lot of it's our own stupidity, and they're mixing together. So let's say, imagine you had an infinitely wealthy society. In an infinitely wealthy society, people could allow to become infinitely stupid. And so it is this duality. And I think it's a combination of them, but something that I'm going to find very fascinating when I'm older is comparing how different societies have faced this demographic issue. And people like to do stuff like, let's say, blame the left or blame Jews. And I'm like, you can trace a lot of this stuff in China. And so if a lot of these same trends are happening in China, it's not the Jews' fault. And because
that's really interesting.
Thank you.
I've not heard anybody say that before.
I invented the idea, yeah. Because China, you have feminism. Birth rate in China is worse than America's, which is strange because poorer countries tend to have higher birth rates. China has, the Chinese government deals with this in the funniest way possible. If you are Chinese, I am terribly sorry you have to live through an Orwellian dystopia. For me, 6,000 miles away, I can chuckle at it. But in China, and this is, again, something we need to talk about as a society, but we don't. The government is going full authoritarian. And so I can see this as the parallel between the Western world and the Eastern world, where in the West, the government enables it. Well, in China, they go against it, where, for example, they've banned playing video games for too long in China. They've banned women wearing bikinis or like porn or like even cleavage in movies because they don't want men to... they want to force men to like get married and like go out with women in order to see boobs. And so a really funny thing is that, so because women can't wear bikinis in China, they have men wear bikinis to model the underwear.
What, I'm sorry?
Yes, exactly. So the Chinese government doesn't let women wear bikinis publicly, so they have men wear them instead. And the Chinese government also has banned homosexuality. So what you're looking at, China versus America, the Western world, the government enables the mouse utopia. In China, the government actively pushes against it using authoritarianism. And so you can see the cultural manifestations of the same underlying trend where everything I talk about, the psychological Black Death, demographic crisis, inequality, it's happening at the same time in both China and America, but you see the same underlying economic trend manifest wildly differently in a different civilization because the context is so different. And so in America, it's right versus left. I think China's going to have a civil war too. I think for them, it'll be basically communist countryside versus capitalist cities, where the right versus the left is weird in China, where their hard Marxist left are the social conservatives and the capitalists are the socially liberal people. So it is, to answer your question, it is an economic thing, but it manifests differently based off the ruling class and culture.
Why would it be happening at the same time in the West and in China?
These cycles sync up. So the last time this cycle hit was mid 19th century. And so Central Europe had the revolutions of 1848, and then France had the Taiping Rebellion 1853, both of which are the Taiping Rebellion is the third bloodiest war in history. In the 1600s, in the year 1645, every major country on earth was fighting both an internal civil war and an external war at the same time. You have a couple that had it before or after. In the year 1348, the entire world was having a civil war and the Black Death. And then you can go back even further, where the Chinese Empire, the Han Dynasty, fell at the same time as the Roman Empire, around 200 AD. Around 900 AD, the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, the Frankish Empire, and the Tang Dynasty in China all fell at the same times. So these cycles are linked historically, and the more interconnected the world is, the more the cycles are linked. And so what we're seeing now is roughly approximate social issues around the world. And I've seen this I lived as a digital nomad for a few years. So in France, there were the yellow vest riots were happening. So I'd see explosions in the streets. In Peru, the Communist Party had just been elected there. In Canada, they have their issues. America has issues. China, right after I went there, it became authoritarian. And they shut down people from the West. India is having its nationalism. Russia is having a war with Ukraine. The European Union is having its crisis. Brazil's getting really ugly. And so this is a normal historic thing where different areas of the world often experience their own crises at the same time as other crises.
As we look back on this moment between the US and China, what response to what's happening now are we going to look back and say that was the right way to play that?
Man, I don't know. If I had a good answer, I don't think anyone's got a good answer. So for the US and China, you're talking about if China attacks Taiwan, right?
I'm just saying more, they're both confronted with the same issue. You got America is right now this huge battle between the left and the right.
Yes.
Which, to give my characterization on the left and the left is compassion. The right is personal responsibility. I think those are given to us by evolution. I think for a society, you need the dynamic tension between the two. But we've got this wild imbalance due to the left taking over all the institutions and pumping out kids that just tend to lean left, but they're now bumping up against reality. So that's what I feel going on in America. And theoretically, what we're trying is, do we reduce freedoms, but within our system, you see a cultural giving up on things like freedom of speech. So that's how things are going here, campus protests, things like that. Over in China, you've got massive authoritarian crackdown. You've got the Uyghurs in concentration camps, but the play there being, hey, we need value homogeny. So we need everybody to see the world the same way. You've also got the credit score. So we're going to gamify, which you'll hear me talk about all the time. Gamification is amazing. And as I build out my virtual world, I think a lot about how do I avoid a Chinese dystopia? But you've got them using credit score, visibility into everything you do, the zero COVID lockdowns, just really stamping down on it. But even though you have to give up your individual rights, will that end up being the right play? So let me go one step further. So there's one more thing just for the audience I want them to hear. China is passing all of these educational reforms, is probably the right way to think about it, trying to make sure that men are more masculine, which is why I was so they're having the men wear bikinis.
That's Chinese media.
Yeah, I didn't see that
the
one
culture.
Coming. So you've got, we only want kids being taught by, we want kids focusing on physical education. We want physical education only being taught by former athletes. We want people looking up to masculine men. We don't want them to become effeminized. Okay, so those are the two different things happening right now.
Yes.
And will either of those be a winning solution, Or is it going to be
Understood.
something else entirely?
They're both going to fail. I mean, you can't force people to do stuff where oftentimes your intentions when you do something or how you do it's more important than the thing itself. And so I think the Chinese are realizing a lot of the Mao's utopia stuff, but when you force someone to do something, it's going to backfire. Like if you have telling people they can only play they can't play video games for longer than an hour a day is just going to make them resent you, and it's going to completely backfire. If the Chinese if the Chinese government forces this upon their youth will just learn to hate those values. And this is one of the things we've seen with the left today, where the left pushes things that are by all accounts pretty good, like racial tolerance, sexual tolerance, whatever, but they push it in such a ham-fisted way that it creates the opposite reaction of a resentful right. And so that's what I would see happening in the left. And I think no government today has the mental capability to understand what's happening, because if they did, we wouldn't have the crisis. And I find that for these historic crises, the worst thing that happens to a society is that they become too constrictive after said crises. So after the Black Death, everywhere in Eurasia except Europe became too socially conservative. After the Black Death, after that whole crisis, China became more authoritarian and they lost a lot of their creativity. Islam became more like hyper fundamentalist religious, and India also became more religious. And so Europe after the Black Death was able to maintain a more fluid social structure, while Asia became more constricted. It's funny I brought that point up 3 times in this podcast so far, but it's not something I talk about that much on the channel. But so if you also look at after the end of the crisis of the 17th century, is that England and the Dutch did the best, because what happens with these kinds of crises is that authorities use the world crisis as an excuse to crack down on dissent. And then when you crack down on dissent, you crack down on creativity. And so with the crisis of the 17th century, it's what killed Italy and Spain as being some of the wealthiest countries in the world. And so the thing that worries me about a crisis like this is, let's say, world crisis, birth rate crashes, psychological Black Death, civil wars. Out of it, like complete religious fundamentalists or people who are authoritarians win, and then we fall into a dark age. Because what happens in this crisis is just like hardcore religious fundamentalists breed, is that like you can say goodbye to science and modern art and all that stuff.
Okay, so if we don't have the playbook right now on how to do this well, neither here, not in China, if you had to solve this problem for us, what does either history tell us or what does your intuition tell us that we would need to do at a cultural values level to avoid the Mao's utopia?
Life is a journey, man. Like, it's the friends we make along the way. Life is the journey itself, and it's not the destination.
Now, do you believe that, and it's just too earnest to say without?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes, it's one of those points that my generation got shoved with propaganda in at such a young age that saying it comes across as ridiculous. But I mean, so the thing is, this crisis is just starting. My estimation of these events has changed markedly in every single year, especially the last 4 years. I don't know what I'll be telling you in 4 years. And the good thing is that we have decades to figure it out. We're going to be here for decades, hopefully. We can face information as it comes, integrate new aspects into our worldview. What I would say, though, is there are several things that are incredibly important. And I should make a video about this, though. One of which is you need to find a way to integrate traditional value systems into modern science and modern culture, where there are lots of things from the pre-industrial world that are just never going to happen again. I can't see at least I hope that arranged marriages don't come back after this, because when people see what non-arranged marriages look like, I don't think they can. Or like, you can't go back to the pre-scientific world because we've seen science. You can't go back to saying God wishes the spheres to orient. We have to incorporate science. And so my hope is that this century is going to be a philosophic and religious golden age as thinkers incorporate as thinkers incorporate, because we don't have the mental tools to deal with what's about to happen. Modernity is predicated upon infinite progress and infinite growth. What happens when that stops? Modernity has to go through a period of self-reflection to figure out mental tools to understand what's happening. So first thing, develop intellectual tools and value systems to assess it. Number two is develop communities. And I think that if there's something I've heard from a bunch of wise friends at Mouse Utopia is if you're stuck in Mouse Utopia, leave the cage. The difference between us and Mouse Utopia is Mouse Utopia is this self-enclosed environment. And it's comparable to the start of the Bible, where Abraham saw the degeneracy of Uruk, and so Abraham went out into the desert with his family and formed the Jews. We've looked at the genetics on that. We've looked at everyone who claims descent from Abraham, and there was a Y chromosome ancestor in that place that time. So value system, form communities of people who are opposed to Mouse Utopia and who can, because I actually think the biggest issue in modern society today is loneliness. So find a way to solve that. And also develop guardrails against insanity. And so, for example, when I saw things were going to go bad, and I saw that we would spiral into political fanaticism, I gave myself rules for bridges I would never cross, because I knew that this would affect me as a person, that my mind is not immune to it. So I told myself, I'm never going to dehumanize my enemies. I'm never going to promote genocide. I'm never going to say that the truth doesn't exist. I'm never going to kill myself. I am never going to promote nihilism. And so I made those rules to myself because I think to myself, Rudyard, you are in a rational place now. There may come a point where you're not rational, so you need to make rules for when you're not rational. And so we need to do that as a society, where I think a great rule is don't enable nihilism, because nihilism has no benefit. If you're like, yeah, like the human race is just terrible and we should never have kids and we should hate each other and everything is lame. Why are you believing that? There's no benefit to believe it. Fourth is establish decentralization. Actually, you guys should watch my manifesto I released a few months ago. Decentralization is incredibly important because my biggest worry here is that authorities use genetic engineering and AI and robots to enslave the population. Because with these technologies that are coming into existence, and again, technology is impossible to predict, but a lot of this tech is already here, is I don't want a society where the government as of now can monitor us every day, every second with these telescreens and that telescreen. The government can listen in on this conversation. I don't think this is a ticking time bomb where if we don't solve this now, it's going to bite us later. And so I think the decentralization of power is my fourth thing, where we need to develop incentives against basically governments using new technology to enslave the populace, and especially so genetic engineering people into subservience. Because the government has every incentive to genetically engineer people to be subservient. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It could be this nanny state, very like helpful, like goodwill government where like, we're going to genetically engineer depression out of existence. The problem is that if you genetically engineer depression, you've genetically engineered everyone who's a social dissident. And so it's this double-sided thing, if that makes sense.
It does very much. I think rules are critically important. It's something I talk a lot about that I think people leave out of their lives at their peril. The rules that you implemented are actually very interesting. The manifesto, why did you write it? What did you want people to take away from it?
Yes. I see a lot of factional development inside the right, where the left has a coherent ideology, the right doesn't. The right's this alliance of all these various factions. And if you guys haven't figured it out, I am some shade of a conservative politically. And inside the right, I see all of these different factions that have nothing to share. And it reminds me, I've read a lot on the evolution and creation of the left over the course of the 19th century. And it reminds me very similarly to a period of leftist history after the French Revolution, where it's just chaos. And I think we're in that place for the right, and the right will develop a new culture. So most of the people I see who are also doing this, they're either sociopaths or grifters. So I thought, what could I do here? I am going to drop my mental model for this before other people do so, to basically get ahead of the competition.